So now you know a little bit about how it all works. It's like really slow speed dating. As we get to each of the workshops, we're going to switch up, and probably some of you found that you were discussing questions 2, 3, 4, and 5 at the same time as 1. That's fine. If we were all in the same group each time, we'd all be done, and we don't want you to do that because NSF has put a lot of money into this. So as you shift around, the focus of each one will probably be different. The groups there will be exchanging ideas differently, and hopefully it will all come together well. I wanted to just say a couple of very quick things. Doug Anderson has joined us now, and I wanted everyone just to know that he is here with us on his birthday. And I'm really pleased that he felt this was important enough to miss an important birthday, or at least part of it. Thank you, Doug. And also, Lena Kilson-Holm is here with us on her granddaughter's first birthday, and her entire family up in Greenland has shared her with us, and I think that really talks about the level at which this is an Arctic and circumpolar family. And thank you, Lena, for coming here today with us. And also, we have Becky D'Angelo, who has joined us here from Yale, who is really fascinated, interested in the Arctic. She's going to be joining some of our groups as we come, not as an observer, but as somebody to help give others perspective. So I hope that you'll welcome her as well coming in. So the agenda at this point is we have 6 presenters. We've got your sheets over here, which are probably a little bit far away to see. We can move those over here if you want to. But we want each of the orators to take as little time as necessary, as much time as I'll let them have, to present the big ideas, the central ideas that came out of your discussions. And as I said, we've got about 45 minutes now, maybe 40 minutes left. I want to go through those and really let's look at the commonalities that come across and the differences. If we have time, then we want to open it up to discussion here. So no more words from me. Jarkko, if you can start with group 1.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, I'll try to be brief. Group 1, and the question was about changing Arctic, and the main and we were the participants: Huang, Bowie, Lovecraft, Farrell, Brusher, and I. So what do we see as the most important changes? And then we basically took the changes as granted, that those issues that have been there during the past 10, 20 years are still there. So there are not really that much new changes, some aspects, but the speed, the rapidness of change is something new, that it happens so much faster than we thought 10 to 20 years ago. So that is new. Then we discuss about some detailed issues about the changes, but as the recommendation was to use as little time as possible, I don't go to those yet. Something new that we discussed was related to the issues that were discussed here earlier this morning, and that was the kind of international politics or geopolitics, the return of the, if not a Cold War, but let's say similar kind of issues. That in 1990s, Soviet Union was collapsed, and we were looking the future a bit differently than what we have what we are facing now in that front in a geopolitical discussions related to the Arctic. And then there is an increasing interest compared to 1990s on the natural resources, which are also non-locally, in a new way, non-locally driven outside the Arctic nations as well. Let me see that I'll try to struggle through these. So those basically were the main points for the first one. Then what are some of the drivers of that change? Basically dependency on environmental resources or natural resources, that local people are still highly dependent, or their livelihoods are dependent, and their communities are dependent on those. So that influences as a driver. Then there's a dependency of globalization, that there are increasing non-local needs for related to the resource extraction. And then there were different drivers of change, governments but also private sector driving the change of globalization and environmental issues. Then economic need for economic diversification from the local level and the regional level is one of the drivers of change, that there is an increasing need for that, too much dependency on one or two sources. Then the loss of human capital, that specifically gendered outmigration, that affects on the social and natural systems and human capital base, basically. Complications that related to in identifying and assessing these drivers. Communication with the Arctic residents and communities about their views and observations, and then some aspects that we need to recognize the diversity of in the Arctic, that we may know something that happens in northern Fenno Scandinavia or Alaska, but that doesn't really apply to circumpolar area, especially if you look at the current issues in Russia, northern Russia. Question C was related to the scales and that kind of issues, and we recognize that there is an urgent need to consider time and spatial scales. I mean, to put it simply, the global versus global, but also jurisdictional scale in specific contexts. And obviously the global scale is creating changes that local scale need to respond and deal with. And then the time scale related to the adaptation, for example, in short term, mid term, and long term, and so on. And finally, what should we be able to do better to improve our understanding? We'll take the main points here. There are quite many of them. Yeah, but I'll try. But I'll try to breathe as well. Okay. We need to have a better understanding through more projects that arrive with fewer assumptions, driven by academics or non-local policymakers, for example, and be ready to talk to Arctic residents, ask people what they think. That is something that we could do better. We could do better in building relationships with people, and to do better communication, collaborate with people that are already there, including scholars who do research there, so that we would try to utilize the already existing human capital in academic sense as well. Need to make communication pathways reliable among researchers and communities, but also between researchers. Funding projects that are holistic, for example, in increasing agency communication and collaboration, and increase broad-based international interdisciplinary research in the Arctic area. And finally, the obvious issue, even though we are doing better than before, we could do better with dissemination of research to public, general public communities, and potentially create incentives for making these broader impacts by scholars among the funding agencies. That's shortly it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are you group two?
No, I'm 3, so yeah.
I'm group 2, but I probably will need a mic because
Okay.
we all have to learn how to present this. So I don't have any notes and everything is here. No, but I have. So if I can get a mic, yeah.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you. So first of all, I would like to say that we praised the organizers for putting us together in such a diverse group that we share very different perspectives on what's happening in the Arctic. So that was a big plus. Bringing different people with different visions together really helped us more than having the same people. So the bullets that are put in here are random. We didn't rank them because we just went in circles. And we also realized from the very beginning that 6 groups or 5 other groups will be doing the same exercise. So basically, the organizers want from us 2 things. One is to confirm that other groups will say, so that this is like a common trend going through all groups, and maybe 5 other meetings. But also to contribute something new, something that nobody else would say. So whatever you will see in those lists, I believe, can very easily grouped into these 2 different categories. One would be larger, that everybody says, and the other one would maybe very short or have nothing very special or really new, but nonetheless keep looking, so that maybe you will. So among the drivers, so we naturally outlined climate, like certainly everybody else, a very rapid pace of social change and self-determination of Arctic people. Then another point was the changing position of the Arctic in global perspective. And it's not like we kind of suddenly we point to the rising level of the Arctic on the global scale, but also about certain ways of downsizing, that the Arctic's role may be inflated because world is preoccupied with things that are not yet coming. Let's say when the climate change hit New York State and the city of New York, all resources will be taken from the Arctic to strengthen the coastline along the east coast of the United States. And that may happen much sooner than we anticipate. We thought the Hurricane Sandy will do that change, but it didn't. Environmental and ecosystem change, and the emergence of the idea of ecosystem stewardship, both by native communities and by the scientific community, that we are far more responsible now for stewardship of the ecosystem. Infrastructure change that transforms into subsistence change, threats to culture and historical heritage. And we have been warned that this theme would be recurrent through many other groups because they definitely conspired to let it be placed on everybody's list. Yeah, what is, I believe, 2 important things that we hope nobody said. It's increasing level of uncertainty as a driver. We believe that's a factor, but it's also a driver. We have to accommodate that with the growing amount of data, the level of uncertainty in our decisions and statements is growing as well. And the last one, cascading effect of everything above and all of these trends and many more. So that we're not dealing with those impacts coming one by one, they are cascading all through. So again, for the jurors to judge which one are new and which one are not. For the drivers of change, again, we ended up with climate change as the most important driver, of course, globalization and economic policies that are very closely linked and influencing each other back and forth, including things that are not normally on the globalization list, like, let's say, pollution becoming a globalized factor, ocean acidification becoming a globalized factor, not something that we normally consider being global factors. Indigenous political participation, and I would put it now better, indigenous political empowerment. That's a very important driver of change. New awareness of communication and communication technologies or techniques or channels, greater openness in this new environment of communication. Emergence of new international players as drivers of change, like Arctic Council, all these major international regimes, arrangements, reviews, reports. We are now living We call it a soup of acronyms, but we're actually living in a soup of international drivers. So that's important. Another very important driver is new regulatory environment, which is growing or strengthening. It's also growing awareness of what is happening, you know, new legal regimes that are becoming drivers of change. And a sub-question was complications. So the complication which we pointed to is aligning needs of scholarly. Oh, okay. This is like among the drivers, you have many levels of drivers, and we go back to that, to the scale question. And complication is how you really align the needs of all these drivers of change. Now, in a more complex environment, it was much easier back 20, 30 years ago when the main drivers were national policies in each of the Arctic states. And now in this international environment, how you align those needs of different players. We really loved the issue of scale. This was something very original. We thank the organizers for kind of throwing out this bone, and we really kind of rejoiced on it. So recognition of scales, very much like a new factor. To those of us who remember, 20, 30 years ago, science, how science was, there was no understanding of scales. It was just one scale of our science. That's it. Now we are living in the environment where we operate at different scales. We learn new words like upscaling and downscaling. We understand how things go up and down that we didn't have, as I said, 30 years ago. And again, complexity of working at different scales. That's an entirely different intellectual environment versus what we used to do, again, working just at one scale level. It's not only vertical scaling, which you have like global scale, regional scale. It's also a polycentric, horizontal complexity. When you have a complex system, complex visions, that you really can analyze, assess, explore, both, as I said, at the vertical level, which is at different scales, and at the horizontal level as being driven by polycentric forces. Funding, intervention, research structure. That was a very important issue we discussed. If you want to intervene, you have to realize at which scale or at what scale you're actually planning to intervene, because method and recipes will be very different. And we use examples of heritage preservation or language revitalization. Do you want to save all heritage across the Arctic? Do you want to save the heritage in a particular locale or a particular language? And how your intervention is being framed by this understanding of different scales. Prioritization of effort. Here again, the scale analysis is extremely useful because you don't have enough money or resources to do everything. And the scaling and polycentric approach gives you at least some clues where you're going to intervene. And one last point is that not scales are born equal. And the most important scale is human life scale. You have to bring down all your scenarios, all your recommendations, your knowledge to the level of human life scan, because this is what people understand. This is what matters to the communities. That is what it matters to scientists as well. You may operate with the scale of millennia, or you may operate at the scale of circumpolar region, but what really matters is the human life scale. And that you have to then upscale or downscale your research or your work to one scale which matters most. Not the only scale, but one that matters most. And finally, doing better. And again, we probably put a lot of things that other people will do or did. Direct your research to more precise or relevant questions. So really be selective in kind of figuring which are more precise and more relevant. do better synthesis of diverse knowledge systems and of diverse value systems, and I will go back to this at the end. Better communication of what we need to know and what we know. That kind of is recurring theme with at least group 1. Better policies, more effective response, better guidance, environmental and social. Better understanding of international and community scales of research and actions. Again, understanding, what can be done better at which scale. Better modeling of the time in the time of uncertainty. And again, hard to read my own writing. In the time of uncertainty, we use examples of forest fires and sea ice and all kind of seasonal cycles. How we do it better in the time of uncertainty, things that, increasing uncertainty of those. And finally, more ethics at all stages of science process and in all disciplines. We are very good, as we presume and declare as social scientists, in understanding the value of ethics compared to our colleagues in other fields of Arctic science. In physical science and in natural sciences, ethics is not the issue they address every day. We do. So we do recommend that inserting more ethics in all disciplinary research, in multidisciplinary research. I remember this very well from my experience on the International Polar Year Steering Committee, where Greta and I were the only social scientists, and we repeatedly pointed our colleagues' attention to the ethical issues of our research. And the glaciologists and the sea ice and the Antarctic drilling people, they looked at us and said, what is ethics? And why do you need ethics in your research? So to us, then, the message is, if you want to do it better, continue pushing for more ethics in research. Thank you.
So I was in a group with 5 very passionate and energetic ladies, so of course. So I need to look at the notes as well, because everything just exploded from the initial question. So.
I never thought about gender equality in each group.
But it was very interesting and fun. So, well, basically we started with important changes affecting the Arctic, and then somebody said climate, and nobody thought that was too interesting, so we moved on. We thought the rest of you might be discussing this as well. So the first thing we talked about was national interest in the Arctic, exploitation of resources and space, and of course we realize this is not a new thing. There's always been international exploitation of the Arctic. There's whaling and mining and so forth, but maybe what is changed and what is really challenged is the amount of different players involved in this. So you have not only international companies, you have NGOs, you have different funding agencies, all sort of wanting to have a piece of the Arctic and wanting to work with locals in different ways. And somehow can be very difficult to navigate. Is this going on and off?
From time to time.
Is it annoying, or it's a bit annoying to me?
Yeah, one of them seems to be very directional. If it's right up your mouth, it's better.
We can try this one. Yeah, so that's the different players, which of course you also have erosion of the old governmental governance, so the old colonial governance of places, and now being replaced by increasingly local governments, happily. But again, there's also a lot of other players feeding into this governance system, so these new relationships are really a challenge. So one thing we then realized as well, we need to really think about constantly is is like regional diversity on all levels. Like there's so many differences from Alaska to Canada to Greenland to Siberia, and this is like there are regional differences, but there's also differences within nations. So within Greenland, there's differences in how these things are experienced and the challenges. So we really need to think about this diversity as well when we are doing research. Yes, and I think you touched upon. Yeah, and then we talked about academics as policy advocates. So we touched a little upon this earlier today, but how maybe we can more directly inform policymakers with no links in between to sort of just add another voice rather than replacing, just being a new voice in very complicated matters. And then we talk about climate change. Well, we tend to focus on climate change and how we can ward climate change and the effects of climate change, sort of in changing from what it was in for instance, the cold north becoming warmer and opportunities closing down. But well, in many places, climate change is a reality already. So, are we good enough at researching this issue? What do you do when climate change has already occurred? How can you continue communities? How can you preserve your heritage in communities where the climate has already changed to a degree where you cannot carry on the old way of life? And maybe we can help create new ways of life where you still preserve your identity and your traditions. Something to think about, at least. In doing exercise like that, we really touch upon this focus on process rather than framework. So this is, of course, working in tight collaboration with the people who are affected by this, and then actually let them guide you through what is the important questions and what do we need to do and how can we help. And these should always be a process back and forth, rather than us coming with major frameworks, academic frameworks, institutional frameworks, basically run over. So a constant dialogue and a process-oriented approach is something that we thought was important in the future. This sort of touches upon resilience, one thing that came up. So we always talking about resilience, sustainability, but what do we actually mean and what is it anyway? Resilience, is that having community that stays with a traditional way of life that they've done for 1,000 years, or can it be the same community changing to new ways of living but retaining its identity? So maybe we need to discuss some of these questions on a more basic level. What is resilience? What is sustainability? And how can we help inform these discussions? Then you have the historic traumas of the colonized. Colin, I'm listening to
Sorry, we're working on it.
giving talking candy lessons.
You're ready. Do we have the other one?
We're John's changing. We're bored.
Yeah, just speak.
You sit down.
Or
Historic traumas. Of course, thinking about the long-term effects also of colonization, of people being moved and being separated from their ancestral places and from their history and from their elders. Something we still have to deal with, something that's in many places still ongoing, and it's a very ongoing process in Greenland as well. And part of this is loss of, we could say, heritage is of course important in some of this. And well, Tom McGovern gave this great talk about how archaeological sites, heritage sites, are rotting all over Greenland. So I will not reiterate that talk because it really hit the mark. This is an incredible record disappearing, but an equal challenge that we're facing is, for instance, the demographic change that we are seeing now in Greenland, probably also in other places is that as people move away from smaller settlement to the larger settlements, Nuuk, and what's up with these? And Sisimiut, we see that, well, the smaller settlements are being abandoned. Of course, that also means the knowledge, the oral traditions about sites, about landscape are disappearing as well, and that's another process which is equally important. So they're getting separated from these local environments and their history. So there's different challenges to loss of heritage, and some of them are climate related, climate change related, or maybe more indirectly related to climate change. So maybe wrapping up this is maybe one of the most important points of ours, is a sort of decolonization process that we really need to think about. So this means, at least in our opinion, is that we need to be prepared to rethink the way we work and rethink our frameworks, our institutions, and then going with that, the local is the global. So we should stop making the distinction between this global thing, because they are just as global as we are. And what we need to do is to help inform policymakers about the complexities of different actions that span environment, industry, and so forth, because that is where, like, we have realized over the last 20 years, it's so complex. Now maybe we need to be better at explaining this complexity to policymakers. So I think maybe I summed up most of it. Do you have any additions, group?
That's fantastic. Thank you. The mobile mics may just have to be positioned well.
I think I'll just speak. Is it okay to speak from here?
Yeah, of
Can
course.
everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So Christian was in a group with 5 passionate women, and I was in a group with 5 passionate men. And unfortunately, none of us was a very good scribe, so we don't have a flip chart, but I have notes. So we focused our discussion really on 2 themes, I would say. One was somewhat inspired by Anna's comments this morning about the workshop of Indigenous scholars, and that one of the main changes that we have seen is the increasing role of Indigenous scholars in research, and that's perhaps for our group one of the most significant changes that we've seen happening. And then another area of focus for us was an increase in inequality and an increase in suffering, and that these are issues that are really critical and something that perhaps we would really like to see as part of the articulated agenda coming out of this workshop. So in terms of the most important changes, so question A, we really focused much more on the political and economic changes, and one of our observations was that, of course, environmental change is significant and important, but that there has been so much focus on that area that, in fact, we've seen that as part of an increasing interest in the Arctic on the whole, and that increasing interest is also a driver of change in itself, and something that communities experience sometimes as a negative source of change, with a lot of interest of researchers at the community level in environmental issues, and not enough focus on other issues or community priorities. So that's something that we talked about in some detail. In terms of some of the drivers of change, one of the drivers we discussed was the increasing role of political involvement and political organization of Indigenous communities at the regional level. And in general, we saw this as a positive phenomenon, but we also noted in the context of research that in many cases, those organizations are the gatekeepers of ethical research practice, and that one of the challenges in terms of really shifting the way that research is done in the North has been in capturing the diversity of community voices and interests. That often there are certain elite members of the community whose perspectives are really magnified, that social scientists play a role in this, and that this is something that we would like to think through as a community of practice and think about ways to address this. Let's see. One of the other aspects of this sort of change that we observed is the politicization of identity that's come about through some of the creation of these regional political organizations, and that's something that social scientists have studied, but perhaps could be looked at more carefully. Let's see, scale. We discussed scale as an issue in the context of this discussion about what are the really urgent questions and whose questions are we looking at and examining, and that this is really a challenge when the changing Arctic is getting increasing attention, and a lot of that attention is at the national and international level, and there are really important issues that are being raised and addressed in those contexts, but that there's still a lag in terms of really elevating a community perspective and a community voice in those forums, that social scientists could potentially play a greater role in doing that, or in thinking through this sort of ongoing challenge of, as things are more integrated across scale, how do we make sure that the questions that we're investigating and the responses that come out of those questions are really addressing the needs and priorities of Arctic residents. So that was a big topic that we discussed. And then let's see. What am I missing? We also talked about, this is a little bit, we'll probably have a chance to talk more about this in question 2, but we talked about another area of change is just the changes in the academy itself, and that, the need to think about how some of the way that the funding streams are structured and the way that that careers in the academy are rewarded are not necessarily enabling the kinds of shifts in research practice that we would like to see. And so how can we play a role in thinking more about that? I would say one of the areas that we talked about for the last, what can we do to improve our understanding of the changes in drivers is looking more at co-production of knowledge and thinking about Lena's talk that we're about to hear, but that we're doing a better job of trying to shift our way of producing knowledge in that direction, but that perhaps we should really, in fact, broaden this and how we're approaching it, how we're thinking about it. So, we noted that a lot of this discussion is framed around Indigenous knowledge, and a lot of there's often a presumption of what counts as or what is contained in the term Indigenous knowledge, and that we could think about this in a much broader way to kind of go back to looking at some of those questions of inequality, of suffering. So that was an area that we discussed as well. And then finally, we sort of thought that it might be helpful, that there would be a need for a specific pool of funding that could facilitate more of these kinds of, we use the term consultation, but that's a loaded term, so that's probably not the best term, but that could facilitate greater involvement before research questions are formulated between communities and researchers, so that we could put into place the right context in which to derive really relevant, important questions that everyone can be involved in answering. It was also noted that the methodology should be considered as part of that, because it's quite important to not that methodology would be critical to that, in fact, that there would be a lot of importance in listening rather than coming in with a sort of pre-formulated idea of what kind of conversation you might be having with the community. Did I represent our conversation accurately? Did I miss anything? Yes. Okay, great,
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think I'm next, group 5. A lot of the things we cover were already touched upon, so it's really hard for me to try to be innovative. I'm trying to kind of pull out some of the things that we did talk about a few things that weren't necessarily represented, at least in a very explicit way, but were probably touched upon. Of course, we considered climate as being an important change and driver, but we also thought about it more as a way that it's affected the discourse of other aspects of the Arctic, particularly globalization efforts, and how a lot of those things are driven by our conceptualization of the Arctic as this place where climate is having real effects, and it is, and it's having it in terms of the scales. I'm going to be a little bit nonlinear here. In terms of the scales, it's affecting it at, in different places in different ways, and some places much more immediate, some places much more distant. And so we talked a lot about that and how we need to understand those things. But we thought about globalization being one of the major changes, the way that it's affected various communities, the way that it's affected our perceptualization of those communities. The way that we're able to communicate with communities that we've never been able to before has been one of the major changes that we discussed. Particularly things like how we're able to have a constancy in the communication that prior, in previous years or in previous decades perhaps, people kind of helicoptered in and did their thing and then left. And then people wondered, well, are these people coming back? What do they learn? What are we learned? And so now, because of social media and all those kinds of efforts, people are connected. I mean, we could improve upon those connections, obviously, and there are efforts by many different governments to do that. But, we're able to keep a constant dialogue and relationship with people in ways that we never have before, and that we consider, in our group, very important, so that there's a relationship that builds and doesn't disappear. So that's some of the things that we discussed. In terms of drivers of change, we also talked about how power relationships changed, the way that the dissemination from the different levels of scholarly work and community work, but also with the different shareholders that are involved, and the involvement of those should be more equitable. We also talked about, we talked about climate change, but we talked about how international media was a really one of the major things that have changed and drives a lot of change. The way that external people visualize the Arctic is often very much through a lens that is often accurate, or maybe not often accurate, is sometimes accurate, but more often very focused on certain things that don't really present the diversity of the Arctic. And we talked about how that's affecting a lot of how things like funding and other efforts in the Arctic development are all being affected. And so changing just our dissemination of the diversity and the people and the processes and issues in the Arctic and how it's represented in the media, we consider to be an important part of our discussion. What else? We talked about how we can maybe diversify efforts and internationalize efforts to collaborate across fields to work in the Arctic, where there's pots of money. They're often separated by national boundaries, and those national boundaries are sometimes limitations in themselves. We talked about how places like Russia, in current conditions, some of the access to Russia and some of the political breakdowns that have been happening are reminiscent of when I was in high school and we used to do Cold War, hide under our desks and things. But it hasn't quite got to that point yet. But these kinds of things are going to affect parts of the Arctic, major parts of the Arctic. When we talk about 7 of 8 countries, we discussed how that 8th country is actually a huge swath of the Arctic, and not having access or knowledge or having open dissemination of research and scholarly work can be really problematic. And so we talked about the need for more scientific diplomacy and the need for visibility of NSF and other efforts when we do international work. So just trying to improve the relationships through that scientific framework, but also working with communities in a very much a collaborative and consultative consulting way. And Catherine and others brought up the need to, like Nora was talking about, to really integrate that at the beginning instead of trying just to tack it on the ends of things and trying to sort of interpret things without having the integration going throughout the methodology, the theorization, the whole aspect of from point A to Z. Should be a more collaborative work. What else? I mean, we also complained about resiliency and the and what it means, and we thought, some of us discussed the possibility of, in many ways, facilitating people to be adaptive, because it's not just about mitigation anymore, it is about adaptation, because these changes are happening. Some of them are irrevocable at this point. So the need to talk about how we go forward, not just in trying to curb things, but also how we're going to deal with the change that's coming. Those kinds of things are important. And so we talked about how to improve our understanding of those processes as well. And did I miss something? All right, I think that covers most.
Chris, the one thing that I think wasn't in there, and I'm only bringing it up because I don't think anybody else has.
Well, I forgot to put the list up.
Yeah, it's, one of the things that we discussed, and this is related to scale, but is a little bit different from the way that most people have been talking about scale, was the way different kinds of institutions or researchers or private sector entities, the pace of their engagement. So the idea that there's a particular temporal scale or timing to academic research, which is very different from private sector sort of development, which makes it very difficult to get integrated into any kind of flow, just even if you don't account for divergent interests or outcomes. But that if we're doing research which is on a 2 or 3 year framework and there's a development project that's on an 18-month framework, getting those to dovetail is extremely difficult. We didn't have good answers to that, but it was one of the issues that we talked quite a bit, we sort of referenced, and I thought just as a scalar issue, the time of different kinds of interventions was one to think about.
Thanks, Doug.
Is there any discussion?
But we've got one more, and apologies that I now stand between you and lunch. And happily, we've had some great presentations so far, so there's not a lot we can add. Yes, one of the big changes is the nature of change. Speed was brought up, but also, I mean, people talk about tipping points, but what we're really looking at with tipping points is moving to new means, right? And so we have dramatic shifts to new places, and those abrupt shifts are also something that's new and different, and they seem to be happening at shorter increments, but it's not just speed in and of itself, but we're moving to new places fundamentally, and that's a very different kind of change than what we've looked at least in contemporary terms recently. The nature and role of government intervention in the Arctic, from local, regional, national, international. Just from the U.S. perspective, all of the alphabet soup of agencies, unilateral, bilateral, multilateral interventions. This is all very new, very complex interagency collaborations that suddenly are necessary. Militarization is one that I think we need to address head on as well. This is a significant government actor that has a tendency, is organized in a way to impose its will without necessarily a lot of local consultation. And this is sort of, but it's a more and more relevant actor in the region, and as we think about the universe of government actors and stakeholders, it's certainly important. Migration. Migration is important not just, we've got Syrian refugees coming across the border to Finland and Norway. There's also economic migration with the sort of the idea of the gold rush syndrome and so on. What you're doing is you're changing the nature of what local community is at the same time, right? So you have traditional communities, but you have growing, changing communities there. And sometimes those changes can happen very, very fast. Right? You have Kirkenes in far northern Norway, which saw 10,000 refugees coming across very fast. 2,000 of them settled in a small town of 9,000, 10,000 people. Now it's a town of 12,000 people. Right? For that place, that is a huge shift, not just in the sort of infrastructure and the social structure, in fact their identity, who they are. What holidays they will celebrate, what languages they will teach in school. It's everything changes about that place and who it is that we need to ask. What are the questions that you need answered? Right? At the same time, this is not all depressing. There are tremendous opportunities in it, right? And not for us to take too dark of a view that a lot of these places, these communities, find real hope and aspiration in some of these changes, and to help them grab onto those opportunities and to push them forward. For example, what we've discussed a lot here before with the empowerment of local communities, both traditional and changing, through all of these new avenues for these new paths for expressing voice in the new channels of governance that are interacting with the Arctic. At the same time, with all of these changes happening across all of these places, it's becoming the differences, the individuality of the places within the Arctic are becoming more apparent. Right? It's never been one place, but it's easy to just call it the Arctic. Right? It's many places with many peoples and many very different, at times opposing interests, circumstances, and that should be factored into our thinking as well. The linkages and the opportunities for learning between these places are at the same time really interesting and dynamic. Linkages facilitated by communication technology, but at the same time through innovations in governance, both informal and formal, and therein there's all kinds of opportunities and challenges for us to look at and to try to offer some aid. In terms of places where we can intervene as a community, as a profession, somehow to sort of adjust what we're doing. In particular, the idea of social impact statements came up, and so thinking about sort of business cycles, right? There's environmental impact statements. Social impact statements are a means, a mechanism for inserting our own research into other decision-making processes. That sometimes takes the form of so-called triple bottom line analysis and of the environment, of the social impact, and the classic profit loss bottom line. That would take some adjustment on our part, but it's a avenue for inserting our conversation into other decision-making systems where we could actually contribute somehow, where we could inform decision, right? A change, an opportunity, and a challenge as well is with all of this change, with its increasing speed and with the abruptness of change, with all of the new actors, the asymmetry between what we know and what the general public knows is growing. Right? And so when we talk about sort of the needs to better inform general audiences, that need is getting that gap is growing, right? It's not a static problem at all. And it's becoming even more dramatic. And as there are more actors, more stakeholders involved, those asymmetries in knowledge are not just a question of, oh, well, it's really important that we need to inform these communities, or it's really these local communities that are affected by these processes. It's not just a matter of in principle, based on ethics, that we should inform the general audience. These asymmetries reflect asymmetries in power as well, and they reinforce asymmetries in power. And so we need to think about it at the same time as an avenue for breaking down some of these asymmetries, just merely through the act of informing, right, and engaging people in a variety of people and empowering people through information and knowledge and learning and sharing that knowledge and learning. With scale, I think there too, there's some interesting questions in terms of the communication side that we talked about, and that's when you're communicating knowledge to a local affected community, what's the scale you communicate it at, right? They're not just going to be interested in their place. They're interested in their place in comparative context and in regional and global context, right? And over time, and sometimes over a very large scale time. And so placing that, as we approach communication challenges, to think about crossing scale, temporal and physical, geographic, with communication, not just the research side of the story. And lastly, and I think this is in some ways the most exciting for our profession, and that is with so many new questions, as well, this was always a false proposition. There was a time some decades ago where it was possible to imagine yourself as an Arctic scientist to be a kind of sort of Renaissance person, where you could know most of what is known. And that's certainly not the case anymore. There's a lot of new questions, of unanswered questions, and that poses the opportunity of renewed focus on sort of a problem-centered approach to research design. That you no longer, when you're thinking about interdisciplinary studies, you don't have to think about, okay, how can the social scientists help out the natural scientists with their problems? How can the natural scientists help out the social scientists with their problems? No, we've just got problems, right? And how do we deal with it, right? And that's actually, you avoid the kinds of institutional inertias and turf battles and, whatever. We've got a whole bunch of new problems, and now let's think about who do we need in the room to help us address it. And that, I think, is fundamentally exciting and something for us to grab onto. Thanks.
Thank you all. It is 12:17 right now. We do have to adhere to a schedule of getting to our 1 o'clock keynote speech, because that is going to be broadcast live. And so I think we'll have to pick up any conversations and discussions in the next breakout group after that.